Now I would like to introduce our keynote speaker to start us off. Maurie McInnis is Professor of American Art and Material Culture and Vice Provost for Academic Affairs at the University of Virginia. Her work has focused on the relationship between art and politics in early America. Her book, The Politics of Taste in Antebellum Charleston, published in 2005, won the George C. Rogers Jr. Award from the South Carolina Historical Society and the Spiro Coast of Book Award from the Society of Architectural Historians. Her most recent book, Slaves Waiting for Sale, Abolitionist Art and the American Slave Trade, published in 2012, was awarded the Charles C. Eldridge Book Prize from the Smithsonian American Art Museum for outstanding scholarship in American art and the Library of Virginia's Literary Award for nonfiction. Maurie served as the curator for To Be Sold, Virginia and the American Slave Trade, and our exhibition would not have been possible without her amazing and path-breaking work. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a thrill to introduce and to invite to the stage. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Maurie McInnis to the library.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for what is sure to be a really compelling day and also a very exciting display of technology that we're all in amazement of, that we can make this work. So we do not know exactly when the last sale of enslaved persons occurred in Richmond, Virginia, the great slave market of the South. The last sale must have taken place, though, before April 3, 1865, almost exactly 150 years ago from today. On the previous day, the order had come to evacuate in advance of the arrival of Union troops who liberated the city. The capital of the Confederacy was in chaos. People were trying to get away with whatever they could. Slave trader Robert Lumpkin still had a jail full of people he was hoping to sell. According to journalist Charles Carlton Coffin, who was there to witness the fall of Richmond, after learning of the order to evacuate, Lumpkin quickly handcuffed his human chattels, about 50 men, women, and children, and marched them 4 blocks south of Danville-Richmond Railroad Depot on the banks of the James River. When they arrived, however, there was no room for them on the train. Soldiers with fixed bayonets back. It was, according to Coffin, the last slave gang seen in the Western world. Lumpkin was angry, but there was nothing he could do. So with oaths and curses loud and deep, Lumpkin was forced to unlock their handcuffs and allow them to go free. Coffin tells us that they had been worth $50,000, but on that Sunday morning were of less value than the mule and the wagon which had drawn the slave trader's trunk to the station. Now, even though Lumpkin's coffle was not, as Coffin had so colorfully pronounced it, the last slave gang seen in the Western world, his comments point to the way that the slave trade had become the iconic symbol of the institution of slavery. With Lee's surrender at Appomattox only a few days later, his prophetic statement became true for the United States. It was the end of the slave traders' slave gangs. Richmond had been, for the previous decades, the epicenter of the northern end of the American slave trade. In these decades, tens of thousands of people had been brought to the city from the surrounding regions, where they had been held in jails, sold at auction, and sent down south, forced to labor in the sugar and cotton fields of the Deep South. From the end of America's participation in the Atlantic slave trade in 1808 until the opening of the American Civil War, 1 million or more people were forcibly relocated through the trade. This massive movement of people populated the American Southwest and resulted in the destruction of hundreds of thousands of families as husbands and wives, parents and children were sold away from one another. The economic engine of the slave trade helped to fuel America's prosperity. The profits from the trade in enslaved people flowed to many places. Traders were not the only ones to profit from America's internal slave trade. Slave owners in the Upper South profited because they received cash for the people they sold. The merchants who supplied clothing and food to the slave traders profited, as did steamboat, railroad, and ship owners who carried enslaved people. Capitalists in the North profited by investing in banks that handled the exchange of money for people, or in insurance companies who provided insurance for owners' investments in enslaved people. So did foreign investors in Southern securities, some of which were issued on mortgaged slaves. Ironically, in the hotbed of American abolitionism, New England, it was also the home of America's cotton textile industry, and it grew rich on the backs of enslaved people, forced to pick cotton. The story of America's domestic slave trade is not just a story about Richmond, Virginia, or New Orleans, Louisiana, but a story about America. It is that story that we are gathered here today to learn more about. The slave trade is not merely a footnote or side story in the history of American slavery, but was central to its modernization and continuation. That was well understood by Boston artist David Claypool Johnston, who used it to powerful illustrative effect in his satirical The House That Jeff Built, when he placed the slave trade at the center of the Confederacy. Playing off the English nursery rhyme, "This is the house that Jack built," Johnston wrote and illustrated a series of 12 verses, beginning with the simple statement, "This is the house that Jeff built." Jeff is Jefferson Davis, and his house is shown as a slave pen, with a sign announcing a slave auction to the left of the door. 3 scenes later, the image shows the inside of a slave auction room with 2 men seated on a bench and 2 women and children standing. These are the chattels, the poem tells us, to be sold by the head in the slave pen, a part of the house that Jeff built. Other images show slave dealers, slave buyers, slave breeders, manacles, and whips. The final image displays the paraphernalia of the slave trade: manacles, an auction hammer, a slave auction sign, advertisements, and bills of sale. For this artist, like so many Americans, the slave trade stood at the center of the Confederacy and was the reason they had continued to fight the war. The last stanza reads, "But Jeff's infamous house is doomed to come down. So says Uncle Sam, and so said John Brown. With slave pen and auction, shackles, driver, and cat, together with seller and buyer and breeder for that. Most loathsome of bipeds, by some called a man, whose trade is to sell all the chattels he can, from yearlings to adults of life's longest span, in and out of the house that Jeff built." On that day in Richmond in 1865, when Jeff's house finally came down, for the first time ever, thousands of people no longer had to fear that at any moment they or someone they loved could be sold away. On April 4th, Abraham Lincoln arrived and was thronged by African Americans. They had lived their entire lives with an auction hammer hanging over their heads. As former slave William Wells Brown explained, "None can estimate the suffering their victims undergo. If there is one feature of American slavery more abominable than any other, it is that which sanctions the buying and selling of human beings." Even though African Americans had always known that the slave trade defined their existence, broader awareness was due to the fact that abolitionists in the 1840s and 50s continually focused on the destruction the slave trade wrought. It was a key narrative element and plot device in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and was central to many of the published life stories of former slaves. Most of these works were illustrated, and what emerged was a somewhat stock way of representing the slave trade. These images were limited both by medium, that is, most of the illustrations were either woodcuts or wood engravings and fairly crude, and by a visual that tended to represent people of African descent in caricatured ways. Typically, artists, such as the ones who created illustrations for Uncle Tom's Cabin and other works, typically depicted the theater of the auction itself. These images generally relied on stock characters and showed an individual slave standing on an auction block next to an auctioneer with his arm raised and a crowd of buyers gathered around. Typically, as writers described auction scenes, they emphasized the market drama, the suspense of bidding, and the theater of the gone of the final sale. Its frequent repetition as both a visual and textual formula made the image of the slave auction expected and almost familiar, which paradoxically diminished both its horror and its impact. So how can we today learn more about the slave trade? The exhibitions in Richmond and New Orleans and this symposium are intended to bring together information about the trade and make it more broadly known to a wider audience. The scholarship of the last 20 years has greatly extended our understanding, yet most of what we know remains fragmentary and incomplete. The most numerous sources, letters and bills of sale and receipts, ledgers and advertisements were created by slave owners and slave traders, and they document coldly the business of selling people. Throughout the exhibition, you will find evidence of the modern business infrastructure that supported the governmentally sanctioned system of human trafficking. Other sorts of evidence, such as eyewitness accounts, were often written by outside observers, and they document a more emotional reaction to the trade. Most of what we know about the emotional impact of the slave trade comes from those who are trapped by it. And those accounts, written and oral, and their narratives speak to the emotional pain of family separations. Yet even they often said that words could not be found to describe its horror. Throughout the day, we are going to hear from the nation's leading scholars on the slave trade who are continuing to extend and deepen our knowledge in multiple directions. I am very appreciative to the Library of Virginia for the opportunity to contribute to the conversation ongoing in Richmond about the place of the slave trade in the city's history. As the former capital of the Confederacy, it seems particularly appropriate that we are gathering here together at just about the 150th anniversary of the fall of slavery and the slave trade. To initiate our conversation today, I'd like to turn to a painting that inspired my own interest in the topic. For abolitionists, images were a powerful way to help audiences see slavery. Charleston-born abolitionist Angelina Grimke once said, "Until the pictures of the slaves' sufferings were drawn and held up to public gaze, no Northerner had any idea of the cruelty of the system. It never entered their minds that such abominations could exist." For me, who taught this painting for many years in class, it was the woman on the left, looking directly out, who really grabbed me. I wanted to know her story, and it was as if she was looking at me across 100+ years and asking me to answer to that story. So to do so, we need to turn our clock back yet again, from that day in 1865 when the end of slavery was finally at hand, to a day about 4 years earlier, when the fate of American slavery could not be known. The day was May 7th, 1861, and on that day, a singular painting was on view at the opening of the Royal Academy in London. That painting was entitled Slaves Waiting for Sale, Richmond, Virginia. The exhibition opened in May of 1861, an important date to keep in mind because that's just a few weeks after the opening shots at Fort Sumter. And the critics were riveted by the painting's subject matter because the war in America was all the talk in London. One declared it the most important picture in the exhibition. The critics were particularly struck by what they saw as the verisimilitude of the painting, because they knew that the artist, Eyre Crowe, was in a unique position to comment on slavery, because he had visited America less than a decade before. The sketches he made and the descriptions he left are unusually evocative, and among only a few visual eyewitness records depicting the slave trade. He saw and recorded details captured by no other observers. His images helped his contemporaries then, and us today, to see the slave trade and thus slavery with fresh insight. But not perfect insight. He was, after all, a white British artist who knew nothing of the experience of being enslaved. There is much about this image today that viewers find too sanitized, too clean. It lacks the depth of emotion that we would expect to see in an image representing such a horrific subject. Yet it had important value then, as it does today, when we begin to interrogate it for what it can reveal about the American slave trade in Richmond. So what I'd like to do today with this image is to use it as a window into the topic of discussion for today and for the exhibition here in Richmond. Viewers today often ask why the painting lacks the emotional anguish we would expect to see. It's important to remember that an artist in the 19th century struggled with the charged topic of slavery. For the most part, difficult subjects were not represented. As one critic said, the system of slavery is too abhorrent to Englishmen to render any representation of it acceptable. And think about it. Why did it take us until 2013 until we could make the movie 12 Years a Slave? American artists in the 19th century shied away from slavery because it was politically sensitive. Paintings were also held to different standards than what appeared in magazines and books. As one critic noted, a picture cannot be shut up and put away like a book. Rarely had people of African descent been represented seriously in fine art. What was much more common was what appeared in books and magazines. And most of those depictions were racist and caricatured. And we're looking here at an image from the British, one of the many British versions of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which flooded Britain and became something of an Uncle Tom mania in Britain. Crowe's own early works were themselves also a bit racist and caricatured. And here is one of his publications from the Illustrated London News that appeared in 1856, about 5 years before he made the painting. The very few paintings that appeared in the Royal Academy depicting somebody of African descent tended to be rather sentimentalized in their depiction, such as William Gale's The Captured Runaway, inspired by Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Crowe's painting stood out in many ways with its significantly different depiction. And his choices were significant. He sought to convey the depth and complexity of the horrors of slavery by representing an entirely different scene than had ever been seen before, and one distinct from the well-rehearsed moment of the auction. This decision might seem a relatively minor choice, but it had dramatic implications. The shift in timing alone forced viewers to consider the topic anew. Instead of drawing attention to the auctioneer and the buyers, Crow focused primarily on the enslaved. In Crow's painting, the viewer is forced to consider the slave trade not just in the abstract and not just as a piece of theater, but instead to recognize that it happened to individual mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, daughters and sons. So let's start with the basics of the scene. Where is he when he paints this painting, or when he sees the image that inspires the painting? So Crow had arrived in Richmond on March 3rd, 1853, and he sat down at breakfast at the American Hotel and looked at the papers. And there he saw the advertisements for NB and CB Hill's sale of people to take place that day. So Crow left the American Hotel, turned right down Main Street, which was the primary business thoroughfare, and walked down what he described as the steep declivity of Main Street, just a few blocks away to the intersection of a street that was called then Wall Street. This is essentially the path of 15th Street today. On Wall Street, he entered the first sales room, likely that of Pulliam and Davis. He discovered that sales were announced by hanging a red flag outside of the doorway, a flag he decried as being blood red. That sanguinary flag haunted him for years, and in the painting, he uses its red color to chromatically link each slave to their treatment as chattel property. From the red vest of the seated man, to the red bows around the necks of the woman, to the red shoes of the little girl, each figure is stained by the fate embodied in that blood-red flag. Journalist Charles Coffin, whom we met earlier, left Richmond and also went to Charleston, and he was there in 1865. And he was so struck by the illustrative purposes of the red flag that he took the one hanging outside a Charleston slave market and sent it back to Boston. It is the one that you see on the screen and the one that is in the exhibition. Crow noted that after each sale was completed, the entire audience moved to the next sale room. He was at first overwhelmed by the multiple sensory stimuli. His eyes swam, his pulse raced, and his olfactory nerves were assailed. In the first two rooms, he merely observed the sales in progress. He later published the image Slave Auction at Richmond, Virginia, depicting the event he had witnessed in the first room. And again, that was probably Pulliam and Davis's auction room. In the third room, he says he was so struck by the sight of a group of slaves seated on benches before the sale that in what he said was a hardly justifiable fit of enthusiasm, he took out his pencil and paper and he began to make a sketch of the scene. The resulting sketch made in this third room is slaves waiting to be sold, and we see it here in a later publication. The original is lost. His sketching attracted considerable attention. Those around him took notice of what he was doing, and when bidding did not proceed, the dealer came over and inquired what he was doing. "I don't feel bound to answer your questions," Crow replied. The dealer returned to his post. But as the buyers remained uninterested in the sale and engrossed in what Crow was doing, the dealer returned to the artist with ill-disguised rage and once again demanded to know what he was about. Crow replied, I'm sure rather snarkily, "You can look for yourself. I am sketching." So the dealer returns to the auction block, but the audience again is more interested in Crow's doings than the sale. A third insistent question from the auctioneer convinces Crow that he'd better get out of there quickly. He departs and notices the entire group headed by the dealer coming after him. He quickly walked down Wall Street, turned on Main Street, and disappeared into the crowd. So let's begin to look at some of the details in the painting and see who populates this image. So who is the man in the background? Well, he's most likely a trader. The traders on Wall Street were Benjamin Davis Solomon Davis, David Pulliam, Hector Davis, R.H. Dickinson, C.B., and N.B. Hill. The man in the image is probably one of the Hill brothers, and the room is most likely their room on the corner of Wall Street and Franklin. It could be this building in the photograph, which was the rooms of R.H. Dickinson, and that was on the north corner of Franklin and Wall, but it was more likely just from his path, the rooms of N.B. and C.B. Hill, but we have no image of that building. So who are these men, the men in the doorway? So these men presumably represent potential buyers. They are dressed differently to distinguish the different classes of men who attended auctions in the city: planters, city slave traders, and itinerant slave traders. Notice particularly the different hats that the men wear. The higher the hat, the more expensive. And top hats, as we see on one gentleman here, were usually worn by men of social rank. So how did these enslaved people end up seated on benches in a Richmond sale room about to be sold? Well, there were some things that Crow did not see when he was visiting Richmond and trying to learn about the slave trade. What he did not see was the first link in the chain of the slave trade. In the slave trading district, these blocks around Wall Street, the sales rooms were near buildings called Negro jails. In these buildings, dozens of men, women, and children were held until they were sold. They were sent there either by individual owners or by dealers who had traveled throughout Virginia and Maryland looking for people to buy. Even though the men and women incarcerated there had committed no crimes, the word aptly describes the penal nature of the places where people were confined until sale. Most of the jails were located near Wall Street, including Richmond's most infamous slave pen known as Lumpkin's Jail. It consisted of 4 buildings: Robert Lumpkin's house, a boarding house where those selling or buying slaves could board at low rates, a kitchen or tavern building, and a jail for housing slaves awaiting sale. There were dozens of slaves at Lumpkin's at any one time, many having been collected in the countryside and sent to jail to be held. Sometimes people were held for long periods to wait for the market to improve. As one trader wrote to Dickinson, "You may confine him in jail until prices rise, and be sure to get a good price." The exhibition and our experts today have done important work on many of these particular individuals who were slave traders in Richmond and elsewhere, and understand more about how their businesses operated. And we'll hear more about this later today. And a business this was. One of the questions often asked when looking at the painting is why the enslaved are wearing such nice clothes. And many assume that this is an embellishment made by the artist. But it's important to know that the nice clothes are part of the marketing, part of the commodification of these people. Traders' account books document how traders spent money on clothes for the people they were selling because they believed that it would help increase the price that buyers were willing to pay. There were businesses in Richmond that specialized in dressing people for sale. Note that each of the women is dressed differently and that the younger women have on gold earrings. Such embellishments were meant to enhance their physical attractiveness. Young women, especially those of mixed race, were often sold as fancy girls, a colloquial term for what Sarah Parker Redmond, a free African-American anti-slavery activist, was willing to explain bluntly. They were sold to be concubines for white Americans. So what are the details of the slave trade that Crow did not show us? There is much about what happened in an auction room that Crow could not represent due to what was considered acceptable in the press and in paintings in the 19th century. In written accounts of slave auctions, observers winced at how enslaved bodies were measured, evaluated, and assessed as commodities. In his own article that accompanied this image, Crow alluded to the common practice of lifting a woman's skirt while she was standing on the auction block. Another visitor witnessing a similar event wrote about the auction of a woman who looked, according to him, permanently pensive and sad. And when put on the block, I saw the big tears slowly and imperceptibly trickling down her cheeks. And he wrote that this was at the moment when the young man lifted her skirts to show her legs. An English visitor to an auction wrote about how people were quite often taken to a room or behind a screen where their bodies were examined even more closely. Andrew's description echoed dozens of others. Sometimes men were asked to roll up their pants so their legs could be examined. Other times they were asked to remove their shirts, and in other circumstances, they were completely stripped. Writers found it difficult to describe how degrading the process was, and thus often hinted at its barbarities without elaborating on its details. Former slave John Brown wrote that he could not, for decency's sake, describe what dealers did. Defeated in trying to find words that adequately could describe the revulsion, he said instead, "What passes behind the screen, only those who have gone through the ordeal can tell. But God has recorded the wickedness that is done there, and punishment will assuredly fall upon the guilty." Now, Crow felt that he could not depict the practice, but he alluded to it in his image. Traders wanted to determine whether they had scars from earlier whippings. So just to the right of the auction himself, Crow shows an enslaved man who's holding a brogue in one hand and stretching out his other arm as if putting his shirt back on. Behind him stands a white man, presumably a trader, who is gesturing towards the enslaved man's back. And this motion is significant. As Crow noted, the value of a slave was diminished by the presence of scars, as they were interpreted by the buyers as evidence not of the cruelty of the former master, but of the restiveness of the slave. Traders and buyers thought that they could read a slave's history and his character from the scars. Multiple incidents of whipping probably indicated a slave who had frequently run away, whereas old scars suggested a slave whose behavior had been modified through the application of the lash. Whereas slave traders looked on these scars as markers of the worth of the individual, Crow saw the backs as evidence of something much larger. Ever attuned to the contradictions inherent in the contrast between American liberty and American slavery, Crow wrote, "A closer inspection reveals a world of and stripes, distributed with not so much regularity as in the flag of the Union." The visual and verbal correspondence that he's setting up there between stars and stripes of the country's flag and the scar stripes of a slave's back was a contrast too painful for him to depict visually. One of the puzzling things in reading this painting today is how we should read the emotions of the figures that are depicted. And for modern viewers, the sentimentalized depiction of emotion can be unsettling. When this painting was created 150 years ago, it was a visual jolt because it had the power to represent these people, enslaved people of African descent, as individuals, something that had never happened before. Remaining focused on these individuals is one of the things that we tried to do in the exhibition. That is, we're trying both to tell the story about the slave trade that deals with the abstract concepts of the numbers of people, the money, but we also want to talk about the stories of the individuals. Crow's painting, by inviting viewers to pause, to ponder, to wonder about the fates of the people depicted, asks viewers to consider the people and not just the numbers. When I began research on this painting, I had hoped that I would be able to figure out who they were, what their names were, where they had come from, and where they had ended up. But because there are no surviving records from 1853, or at least none that have yet turned up for this particular trader, I was not able to do so. Instead, these people stare out at us across the century and a half and ask us to think about them as individuals, but also the other tens of thousands of individuals that they represent. The women's expressions are ambiguous, perhaps accurately depicting what Crow would have witnessed, even if he did not fully understand its import. As historian Walter Johnson has artfully explored, people in the slave marketplace learned how to alter their external appearance and attitudes in order to look after themselves. So two of the women in the painting look towards the doorway. They are examining the man who are entering, as if assessing the advantages or disadvantages of one buyer over another. The enslaved learn much about how to read buyers, from the clothes they wore, the questions they asked, and the expressions on their faces. For most people in the market, being for sale required a double consciousness, representing an outward appearance that masked their inner self. It was rare, according to outside visitors, to see unmasked emotion, such as that we see in the face and posture of the man in Crow's painting. Instead, viewers commonly reported seeing people who appeared happy, such as the woman with the child in the painting. Although it would not have been apparent to most white observers, they were performing a part in order to exert what little control they had at that moment in the marketplace. Once they had assessed the potential buyers, they could choose to appear likely, which was the period term, for one buyer, and sullen for another. Almost as a bookend to the male figure on the right, the woman on the left, with her multicolored head wrap, her back to the traders, and looking directly at us, the viewer, appears completely dejected. Seated behind the stove, which provides the only heat on that chilly day, much like our own today, she appears to have little interest in the proceedings. Her presence in the painting provides evidence that in addition to those slaves who were actively trying to shape their individual outcomes, there were other slaves who could barely go on. She looks out at us, asking us to bear witness to this injustice. As viewers, we will never know the fate of the people represented. Would the mother be sold with her nursing child? And what about the other two children? And there's no way for us to know. Nursing infants were sometimes kept with their mothers, but not always. As Jenny Proctor of Texas told an interviewer in the 1930s, sometimes he sells the babes right from the breast. The dread of being separated from her child prompted Daphne, who was sold at auction in Savannah, to wrap herself in a blanket, concealing her nursing child. It was very common for older children to be sold away from their parents. The young boy in the painting appears already to have been sold away from his mother. Amelia Jones of Kentucky tells us how that often happened. The day the master was to sell the children from their mother, he would tell the mother to go to some other place to do some work, and in her absence, he would sell the children. Solomon Northup tells us of Eliza, who was with him in a slave jail in New Orleans. First, her son Randall was sold, even though Eliza was crying aloud and wringing her hands. Then she herself was sold. Upon hearing this, she broke from her place in the line of women, rushing down to where Emily was standing and caught her up in her arms. Her pleading persuaded her purchaser, who offered to buy them both, but the slave trader Theophilus Freeman refused. Solomon tells us, to this humane proposal, Freeman was entirely deaf. He would not sell her on any account whatsoever. There were heaps and piles of money to be made on her, he said, when she was a few years older. She was a beauty, a picture, a doll. And in those lines, it is very clear that Eliza's daughter's, Emily's, future was to be sold as a fancy girl. The most distinctive figure in the painting is the man on the right. While most images of slavery appearing in abolitionist materials only reified white superiority and white power, Slaves Waiting for Sale is the first to ask viewers to consider the possibility of Black power. Crow represented Black resistance in the crossed arms and clenched fists of this figure. Here was something startling for white audiences to consider. The man in Crow's painting was described by critics by a list of adjectives rarely in Royal Academy reviews: sullenly resigned, and displaying suffused indignant scorn mingled with defiance. Crow accomplished this transformation from the original 1853 sketch by making a number of significant changes. Most obvious is that he eschewed the racial caricature of the earlier sketch, perhaps suggesting that he worked from a live model in his London studio. Crow shifted the man's bodily stance as well as the expression on his face. By taking off his jacket, the clothes that symbolized his status as chattel property in the slave market, the man has demonstrated his unwillingness to comply with the usual costuming that was the central element of his commodification. Crow had also made the man younger, and by taking off his coat, revealed his powerful arms. This man was neither the supplicant and pleading slave who had dominated anti-slavery imagery for decades, nor was he the gentle and faithful Uncle Tom, accepting his fate with Christian resignation. So Crow in this image had created an entirely new image of an American male slave. These elements suggested a slave who could, at any moment, resist, run away, or rebel with force if necessary. So what had changed? From the time of the initial 1853 sketch to the execution of the painting in 1861, Crow's understanding of American slavery had deepened. The artist was surrounded by anti-slavery activity in London and many formerly enslaved people. Perhaps he had seen Henry Box Brown's moving panorama, The Mirror of Slavery. Brown's story would have been of particular interest to Crow, since Brown was a fugitive slave who had escaped from Richmond by mailing himself to Philadelphia in a box. Crow might also have seen the other anti-slavery panorama, that by William Wells Brown, who extensively toured his panoramic views of the scenes in the life of an American slave. Or perhaps he went to the Wesleyan Century Hall in September 1860 to hear the former slave Theodore Gross. If so, he would have heard of Gross talking about being sold on the block 4 times. And he would have heard Gross tell the audience that the misery of slavery was not in being hungry or being whipped. But Gross had said, that which preys upon his mind is the thought that his wife and his children and his nearest relatives may any day or hour be sold and sent away where he will see them no more. So we are left wondering what happened to the people depicted in Slaves Waiting for Sale. Well, they were most likely purchased by traders from other cities, especially from New Orleans, and they were probably sent down south, where they would be sold again. And there they encountered a very different slave market, one where they would most likely be purchased not by traders, but by slave owners and put to work in the sugar and cotton fields. In his painting, Going South, Crow depicted the scene he saw at the Petersburg-Richmond Railroad, the terminal on 8th Street near the Canal Basin. Clearly visible is the Virginia Capitol Building, the spires of Richmond's churches, and the large Franklin paper mill. There he captured the chaos of the moment as families were separated and people were sent to unknown fates, hundreds of miles away, probably never to see their loved ones again. In New Orleans, they were sold not on a back alley in dingy rooms, but in the grand ballrooms of the city's 2 primary hotels, the St. Louis and the St. Charles, or from slave pens lining the streets nearby. In these grand spaces, the auction was an even greater theatrical event, one that was celebrated in a social event in New Orleans. In New Orleans, slaves from Virginia were particularly valued. And in all of the Richmond slave trader account books, you can find thousands of sales of traders who were from New Orleans. J.M. Wilson, whose broadside here, advertising sales of slaves from Maryland and Virginia, appears frequently in the count books of Hector Davis, and they were advertised frequently in the newspaper. Today's symposium gives us an opportunity to learn more about the system of the slave trade and the people whose lives were altered by it. At the end of the war, others too understood that the slave trade defined slavery. Nearly 150 years ago, after decades of steady business along Wall Street in Richmond, the auction rooms were finally silent. The detritus of the quotidian business of human trafficking littered the floor. Shackles, bills of sale, advertisements, receipts, and ledgers. On April 8th, only a few days after the fall of Richmond, as Richmond streets and the fire still smoldered, Massachusetts abolitionists Sarah and Lucy Chase entered Richard H. Dickinson's slave trading house on the corner of Franklin and Wall Street. And there they scooped up 2 ledger books, which you can see in the exhibition, and a stack of correspondence documenting the sale of thousands of men, women, and children. When they first saw Richmond from rockets, the docks of Richmond, they were struck by the symbolic image of the burned out city. Sarah wrote that nothing was left of the warehouses but the brick walls, ragged and jagged, pointing their threatening fingers to heaven, as if saying, there is justice. Inside the ledger she took, she noted that Dickinson had recorded the sales of people on March 31st, but not for April 1st, the day before Confederate retreat. On that day, only the date was written. There were no sales. Thank God, she wrote, no more was written or will ever be written in that bloody register. As Lincoln toured the city, as Union troops filled the streets, as the auction rooms fell silent, thousands rejoiced that they would never have to fear the slave market again. At the end of the war, abolitionists such as the Chase sisters collected documents and artifacts related to slavery and the slave trade in order to preserve the memory of the trade and document why they had fought and why the sacrifice had been necessary. But with the resurgence of white supremacy in the late 19th century, much of that history was wiped out and deliberately removed from public memory. In Richmond, for example, the buildings were quickly repurposed or destroyed. First the railroad and then I-95 forever altered the landscape where most of the trade took place. But the story of the slave trade lived on in the family histories that African Americans told. And in the last decade or so, public attention has increasingly focused on this story. Exhibitions such as the ones here in Richmond at the Library of Virginia and at the historic New Orleans collection have led to new discoveries of stories long buried. For example, at the Library of Virginia, the work in the Public Records Archives has unearthed moving testimony in court cases caught up in the slave trade and have helped to bring more individual stories to life. This new research and the community conversations now underway will hopefully give all of us an opportunity to make sure that it is never forgotten again. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. The last time I heard you speak and present your work on this painting, you talked at more length about the commerce that grew up around the 17th Street area of Richmond and the merchants, primarily Jewish merchants. Mm-hmm. I wondered if you would expand on that today for us so that we get a fuller picture of
Sure.
what the commerce entailed.
Yeah, so most of the traders are located on Wall Street, but not entirely. There's, in the blocks running in both directions are the location of many traders, and they move around over the period. They move from location to location. They form new partnerships. They go in of business and out of business. So there's a lot of fluidity. It's really hard to get a fix on all the locations where the slave trade took place. And then around them are lots of businesses that emerge to support the sale of humans. So the most obvious one are those who are traders in clothes, who are specifically making clothing for the traders to dress people before the sale. But there are also all the other kinds of suppliers. People are being held in jails sometimes for weeks on end, and so there are the food suppliers, and there are the people bringing coal for heat or wood for heat, the people making shoes. We even find jewelry being sold, particularly for fancy girls for sale. So that larger infrastructure that supports both the jails and the auctioneers emerge mostly in those blocks surrounding Wall Street, kind of stretching up to about 14th Street and over to about 19th Street. And so in that area is really a kind of slave trading district where that's the dominant business. And then the other businesses that fill in are not elite, they're not places elites would go, right? They are a livery stable or a carriage manufacturer or somebody making brooms. They're kind of light industry. So it was a district that was filled with the smells of industry of the 19th century, and these are not nice smells. Filled with the smell of horses that are being stabled, and because it's near Shockoe Bottom, also a kind of muddy, swampy place much of the year. It's the least valuable land in the city of Richmond. But of course, it's only a few short blocks away from the Capitol building, from the city's primary churches, and from the city's main business along Main Street. But it's really kind of tucked away, and you only went there if you had business there.
A question from our Twitter account. Kate Mason in Great Britain wants to know, how does British shock and horror at American slavery, as seen in Crow's images, fit into the country's own long legacy of enslavement?
Meaning Britain's legacy of enslavement?
I would think so.
Yes. So the relationship between Britain and America in anti-slavery activity is really vital. So the long history of anti-slavery activity we try to give an introduction to in the exhibition, because anti-slavery activity first emerges in Britain not around ending slavery, but around ending participation in the international trafficking of people, ending the African slave trade. That's where anti-slavery activity begins around 1797. The British are not successful in ending their participation until 1807. The US joins in officially no longer participating in the African trade in 1808. But Britain still has slavery even when they've ended the African slave trade. Britain has huge numbers of enslaved people in what they called the West Indies, what we would call the Caribbean. Hundreds of thousands, millions of enslaved people from Africa are sent to the Caribbean, probably around 4 million people, to labor there in what is predominantly a sugar industry. The planting and harvesting and production of sugar is very dangerous, and there was a very high death rate of the people working on the islands. Jamaica is the largest of the British possessions, but there are many others. Finally, in 1834, Britain outlaws slavery in their colonies and frees the enslaved people. There's a period there for 4 years where they've been put in what they called apprenticeship, which turned out to be really little different from enslavement. And in 1838, the apprenticeship ends as well. So British anti-slavery activity had changed from the ending of the slave trade to then focus on ending slavery. And American abolitionism begins to emerge at that moment in the 1830s when the British are really focusing on ending slavery. And there's enormous amounts of discussions between British anti-slavery activists and American anti-slavery and abolitionist activists. And so there is great partnership there, and a lot of the energy and support does come from this transatlantic conversation. But the reality is that even though Britain had ended enslavement, their wealth in the 19th century, like much of American wealth in the 19th century, is built on the backs of the profits from cotton production. And Britain's textile mills, which is part of much of their economic prosperity of the 19th century, is dependent upon American slavery.
Yes, mine is a very simple question. I think you mentioned something about the prices falling and rising, and what would have caused that to happen?
It had to do with the season of the agricultural economy in the Deep South. So there were periods when there were more traders from New Orleans and other places in the Deep South coming to Richmond looking for people, and therefore more demand, because it's about time to take them there to get them into the fields for the next season. And then there are periods when that demand diminishes. It has some fluctuation with the price of those crops. So whenever there's a dip in a cotton price, there tends to be a dip in the price paid for people.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I had a question. You talked about the auctioneers and their bills of sale and their ledgers. I come here from 30 years ago from Jersey to Virginia, not knowing that my family was part of the African Americans that migrated to Jersey from Lynchburg. And some of the exhibition, there were some auctioneers that sold into Lynchburg or that area. How would you, so I came for a crumb from that exhibition, right, and I've come with this was a great symposium, first lecture. How would you, the one book that's in the demonstration or out there, what would your suggestion be to find, because these people that may have been part of that, those that were sold. I noticed that most of the slaves only had first names, and they went into maybe you can say your last name was Jackson and went into Lynchburg, but is there really at this time a way to even trace that as we try to get closer to our homeland, Africa, trying to find out where our families really came from?
Right. Crumbs are right. It's really, really challenging. Most records don't survive. The bulk of the records that traders would have kept no longer survive. We were very fortunate that in many cities, as the war was ending and abolitionists came in, that they swooped up some ledgers and letters, and much of what we have that survives comes from that period. But what it means is it tends to only document those last few years right before the end. As we get back into the early 50s and back into the 40s, there are many fewer records. I have a dream that someday we will find a granting agency or somebody who wants to pay for us to create a crowdsourcing project where we would transcribe every ledger and every letter and every coastwise manifest. Because if you were put on a boat and shipped around to New Orleans, that record's probably sitting in the National Archives. And you do find more last names there, although as we know from the case of Solomon Northup, a lot of those names get made up as opposed to being real names. So it's an incredibly difficult process for those who are hoping to find evidence of their family members, and very difficult. Now, I do know, related to Lynchburg, there is one small surviving account book of a trader in Lynchburg that's owned by the Chicago History Museum. It's not very big, it's not very extensive, but that's the only one I know. And maybe today, when we have time to talk to the other experts here, maybe somebody else will have some other suggestions for
Who
you.
would that trader's name be?
I don't recall, unfortunately. Did you look at it when you were there? No, yeah, I don't remember his name. But if you go to the Chicago History Museum and correspond with them, I'm sure they'll help you find it.
All right, we've got a question that's come in from New Orleans. What happened to the slave trade workers in the aftermath of the Civil War? Many were third-generation traders. Is there any record of what happened to this culture of traders after their industry ended?
That is a great question, probably for somebody else, because I haven't done any work on the traders after the war. Can you hold that one for when we get to our panel? Because we have on our panel a number of people who've done more work on individual traders who probably can do a better job answering that than I.
We'll do that.
Thanks.
I want to say one of the things that I appreciate about the symposium and the exhibit is that it helps us to understand the ethos, the culture, the norms of the time. And one expression that you used rang in my ears, and that was your discussion of the fancy girls and what that implication is in terms of concubinage and whatever. What's particularly interesting to me is that I recently heard an expression coined. I didn't give it much credit until I listened to yours, written in the book called Israel and the Appomattox, in which there was a description of a young slave male who was a fancy boy. And the implication that I got from that was that he was more being groomed to be a valet type of character. Do we have any information about what a fancy boy, or even more information about what a fancy girl was in that culture?
Yeah. We know more about fancy girls because they're mentioned extensively, and they are almost always of mixed race, and they're young, and the implication is certainly that they are being sold for sexual predation. And there's lots and lots of talk of them, and they tended to be talked about very specifically in skin color gradations, as well as beauty. Fancy boy is also a term I've come across in a couple of different places. The one that sticks out in my mind is a Richmond artist named Moses Ezekiel, whose grandparents were in the textile trade and specifically dressed enslaved people for sale. They had a shop on 17th Street, and he writes in his memoirs of remembering people being brought to his grandparents' shop to be dressed for sale. And he mentions both fancy girls and fancy boys in that description. I know less about exactly what that term meant in relation to fancy boys. I make many of the same guesses and speculations, the idea that they were probably then working in the house, and maybe as a valet or something that's very close to an individual. But there are always other possibilities.
A question also from our Twitter account. Dana Bird asks, what art history material culture research remains to be done today?
There's always material culture work to be done. It's often very challenging. So material culture is a term that we use to describe the stuff of everyday life that isn't artwork that you hang on a wall, right? Now, it can also mean artwork hung on a wall because it can be about the kinds of questions you ask about it, less about with whom did Eric Crow study, and let's look at the evolution of his style, but focused instead on what it can tell us about the lived experience. And the beauty of material culture, the stuff of everyday living, is it helps to give life and experience to those whose lives are otherwise perhaps not documented. So there's still so much more for us, I think, to discover that relates to the history of enslaved people and might relate to the slave trade, but it's probably in people's family collections, private collections, not currently being owned by museums and therefore known to the public. So we really need everybody to kind of, dig through their attics and ask their families, what do you have, or what do you know, what stories have survived, in order for us to continue to expand this story and our understanding.
Good morning, Dr. McInnis. I have a twofold question. You had touched on the making of 12 Years a Slave. And I wanted to maybe just go back before that a few years to 1984, when Gordon Parks made Solomon Northup's Odyssey. And at that time, it was a televised PBS miniseries. It wasn't necessarily seemingly well received, but you had remarked that it took until 2013 for a British director to recreate, in essence, Solomon's journey. And I wanted to know if, in comparison to Ira Crow's paintings, the earlier work, the initial work, and then the painting, Slaves Waiting for Sale, do you think it was in contrast of making something somehow seemingly more pretty than it initially really was, that you would compare that to the two versions, a telecast versus a film? Would the two, and presenting them in two different forms, would one be more appealing, more palpable than another? Or is it more of a political change, something in the landscape, of society that's sort of the trend, the change in wave that's creating that conversation that we're having today?
Right. So whenever we're looking at visual works of art, the medium does matter. And the difference between anti-slavery wood engravings that show up in the Illustrated London News that's supposed to be a very sort of, light and entertaining publication, and a painting on the walls of the Royal Academy, they have very different audiences and very different purposes, in the same way that movies and television are also very distinct. But I do think it's more than the difference of the medium in 12 Years a Slave. the graphicness of the violence, which was endemic to the institution of slavery, is something that that audiences were ready to see in 2013 in a way I don't think they would have decades earlier. So that was really what I was getting at when talking about this ability to be able to deal more honestly with the emotional anguish of the characters being represented in earlier times, cleaned up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Anthony Peak. I'm from Jacksonville, North Carolina.
Hi.
Thank you again, Ms. McInnis. I got here late, so sorry the interruption. I'm here representing Alex Haley, grandson, Michael Baker. And while I was here going through the Virginia archives, I pretty much stumbled across this, and I would like to speak with you afterwards. But he has artifacts that his grandfather laid. And for y'all that know the story of Roots, Spotsylvania County, it's very interesting that I'm here. And I came here just to get your information because I have something that would probably knock the walls off of this building. And I encourage each and every one of you, if you're looking, like she did state, it is hard to find information. Luckily for him, his grandfather already paved the highway for him. And so I'm up here crossing T's and dotting the I's. And I just look forward to seeing more of your work. I like what you're sharing. And is this information available to the public, what is being recorded today?
Is it going to be recorded and archived?
Yes.
Yes. So yes, it will be. Thank you. I look forward to talking with you later.
Maurie, we've got one last question before we break, and this is from New Orleans. The Richmond painting depicts a scene in an enclosed space with people dressed for sale. The New Orleans sketch shows a scene in a very public venue with the people for sale half naked, a large audience milling about, etc. Can you comment on the similarities and differences between these transactions in Richmond and New Orleans and the significance of those differences?
Yes, so the image in New Orleans is created by somebody who never witnessed a slave auction. And most of the images, not all, but most of the images of New Orleans, that is true. In the imaginary of many artists, they perhaps even desired the idea that a slave auction would depict many women undressed, standing there for sale. And in fact, that was done in 12 Years a Slave. From most of what we know from many, many dozens and dozens and dozens of people's accounts, that isn't actually how it happened. People were dressed for sale, and when presented for auction, usually fully clothed. But as I talked about in the talk, they were very commonly taken prior to sale to another room where they may indeed have been undressed and examined. It wasn't usually part of the public display. Spaces for the slave sales were different from Richmond's, and it speaks very much to the economic place of the slave trade, the difference to the place of the economic slave trade in the two cities. In Virginia, most of the people who are being sold by Virginia or Maryland slave owners who are selling off one or two people here and there in order to realize cash from the sale of people. And they're not buying enslaved individuals. In New Orleans, and then they're mostly being purchased by traders. The slave trade in Virginia, in many ways, fuels and continues Virginia's economic prosperity, but there's not great new agricultural growth going on. Most of the fields are already under production, But in Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama and so forth, the slave sales are attended primarily by people who are going to be their next owner, who are going to put them to work in their sugar or cotton fields. It is about the future. It is about economic expansion. And the sales in New Orleans take on this grand affair because in many ways it's about planters coming to demonstrate their own power and their own wealth through the number of people that they are buying each season. So they're very different places. Thank you all for coming.